I was standing on a hotel balcony in Lisbon at 11 o'clock at night, still wearing the blazer I had worn to the client dinner, when my phone buzzed with a photo that made my stomach drop straight through the floor of that beautiful old building. It was a picture of my twin sister, Vivienne, blowing out 35 candles on a 3-tier cake in our parents' backyard, string lights glowing behind her, half the extended family crowded around clapping, and underneath it my mother had written, "Happiest birthday to our girl, we love you more every single year." I sat there staring at that caption for a long time because Vivienne and I share a birthday. We are twins. The same date, the same hospital room, 4 minutes apart, and somehow, for the 4th year running, my name appeared nowhere in that caption, nowhere in the group chat, nowhere in the 63 photos my mother posted over the next 2 hours from that party. Not one person mentioned that it was also my birthday. Not my mother, not my father, not my aunts, not my cousins, and not Vivienne, the woman who had come out of the womb 4 minutes before me and had apparently decided somewhere along the way that those 4 minutes gave her the entire day. I want you to understand something before I go further, because I need you to feel exactly what I felt standing on that balcony with the warm Lisbon wind pulling at my hair and the sound of fado music drifting up from a restaurant 2 streets over. This was not new. This was not a one-time slip, not an honest mistake made in the chaos of party planning. This was the 4th consecutive year, and if I am being fully honest with myself, it stretched back much further than that if I really counted. But this year was different in one very specific way, and it is the reason I am telling you this story tonight. This year, I was not even in the country. I was 7 time zones away, closing the biggest contract of my professional life, sitting in a 5-star hotel that I had earned through 11 years of relentless work, and my family did not even notice I was gone. They did not notice because noticing me had never really been part of the plan. I did not cry that night, not right away. I remember setting the phone face down on the little wrought iron table on that balcony and just breathing for a while, watching the lights of the Alfama district flicker across the rooftops, feeling something inside me go very still and very quiet, the way the ocean goes still right before a big wave decides to come in. My husband Desmond was asleep back in our room, exhausted from helping me rehearse my pitch deck until 2 in the morning the night before. I did not wake him. I just stood there and let the quiet do its work, because somewhere in that stillness I made a decision that would change the next year of my life, and eventually change my entire family. Let me back up, because you cannot understand why that photo hurt as much as it did without understanding the 18 years that came before it. Have you ever had a sibling or any family member quietly erase you from your own story while everyone around you pretended not to notice? Tell me in the comments, because I promise you, by the end of this one, you are going to want to talk about it. My name is Delaney Ashworth, and I grew up in a modest brick house in a suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio, with my twin sister Vivienne, my older brother Nathaniel, and our parents, Constance and Gerald Ashworth. My father worked at a manufacturing plant for 32 years, steady and quiet, the kind of man who showed love through fixing things rather than saying things. My mother stayed home when we were young and then worked part-time at a dental office once we were in school, and she was, and still is, a woman who runs on the fuel of other people's approval, particularly the approval of her own mother and sisters, which mattered more to this story than I understood for a very long time. Vivienne and I were identical in the genetic sense, but from the moment we could talk, we were treated like 2 entirely different species. She was, by every family account, the sparkly one, bubbly, loud in a way that made rooms turn toward her. She loved being looked at, and our relatives loved looking at her, and somewhere in that mutual loop, I became the quiet twin, the serious twin, the one people described as so mature for her age, which even as a child I understood was a polite way of saying the one we do not have to worry about. By the time we were 6, our birthday parties had already developed a lopsided shape. Our mother would decorate the house in whatever theme Vivienne wanted that year, princesses, mermaids, later on horses and then boy bands, and I would get asked, almost as an afterthought, "And what do you want, Delaney, the same as your sister or something different?" I always said the same as your sister, because I could feel, even at 6 years old, that a different answer would create friction, and I did not like friction. I liked things being smooth. I liked people being happy. This is important because it is the exact trait that our family would later exploit for almost 2 decades without any of us fully realizing it was happening. There is one incident from when we were 16 that I now understand was the true origin point of everything that followed, and I did not see the shape of it clearly until I was 34 years old standing on a balcony in Portugal. The spring of our sophomore year, my father was laid off from the plant for 4 months during a restructuring. Money was tight in a way it had never been tight before. My mother was working extra shifts at the dental office and coming home exhausted, and there was a specific week in early October, right before our birthday, when I watched her sit at the kitchen table with a stack of bills and just put her head down on her folded arms for a long moment before straightening up like nothing had happened. Vivienne had already told our mother she wanted a Sweet 16 extravaganza, a rented hall, a DJ, 60 guests, the whole production. I remember overhearing my mother on the phone with my Aunt Rosalind, her voice tight with the specific stress of a person trying to make math work that does not want to work, saying she did not know how they were going to pull off a party like that this year on top of everything else. That night, I found my mother alone in the kitchen, and I told her something I meant with my whole 16-year-old heart, something I intended as a one-time gift, not as a lifelong policy. I told her, "Mom, you don't need to do anything for my birthday this year. Seriously. Just do Vivi's party, she'll be so disappointed if she doesn't get it, and I really don't care about a big thing, I'd rather just have a quiet dinner with you guys." My mother cried a little and hugged me and told me I was the most generous, most mature child she had, and that she would make it up to me. And she did try that year. We had a small family dinner 2 days after Vivienne's giant rented hall party, just the 5 of us and a grocery store cake with my name written on it, and I remember feeling genuinely happy that night, proud of myself for having eased my mother's burden during a hard season. It felt like an act of love, freely given. What I did not understand, what none of us understood in that kitchen, was that I had just handed my family a script, and they were going to keep reading from that script for the next 18 years without ever checking whether the actress playing the generous, low-maintenance twin still wanted the role. The following year, when my father was back at work and the family finances had stabilized completely, nobody asked me if I wanted a party. It was simply assumed, without a single conversation, that Delaney does not care about her birthday, Delaney prefers things quiet, Delaney is happy just watching Vivienne have her moment. And here is the part that took me years of therapy to fully articulate. Vivienne noticed this dynamic too, and instead of ever pushing back on it, instead of ever saying, "Wait, it's her birthday too, let's do something for her," she leaned into it, gently and then not so gently, year after year, because it benefited her enormously to be the only twin anyone was celebrating. I remember one specific afternoon in 8th grade that I did not think about again for almost 20 years, until it resurfaced in therapy long after Lisbon. Our school held a talent show, and Vivienne signed up to sing, and I signed up quietly, without telling anyone at home, to present a scale model I had built of a redesigned version of our town's public library. Something I had worked on for weeks in the garage using foam board and balsa wood, and a set of drafting tools my grandfather had given me. The talent show fell on a Thursday night, and my parents came, and they sat in the 3rd row, and when Vivienne walked out to sing, my mother pulled out her phone and recorded the entire performance, standing partway up out of her seat with the kind of pride that makes a person forget where they are. When it was my turn, 20 minutes later, to walk up and present my model and explain my design choices to a small panel of judges, I looked out into the audience and saw my mother leaning over to whisper something to my father. And neither of them had their phone out, and I finished my presentation to polite applause and came home that night with a runner-up ribbon for design and innovation, and nobody in my family asked to see it until almost a decade later. When Desmond found it in a box in my parents' attic during a move and asked why it had never been framed. I did not resent my sister for singing well that night. She genuinely had a beautiful voice, and she deserved that recorded moment. But I noticed, even at 13 years old, that there were two very different emotional economies operating in our house. One where achievement was met with cameras, and one where achievement was met with polite applause. And I quietly filed myself into the second category without ever being told to. There was another moment, during our senior year of high school, when I was accepted into an early architecture pipeline program at Ohio State, a genuinely competitive placement that only took 12 students statewide that year. I came home with the acceptance letter practically vibrating with excitement, and I found my mother in the kitchen helping Vivienne choose fabric swatches for prom dress alterations. And when I told them my news, my mother said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," while still holding a swatch of blue chiffon up against Vivienne's shoulder, her eyes never fully leaving the fabric. I stood there for a second longer than I needed to, waiting for a follow-up question that never came, and then I went upstairs and called my grandfather instead, the same one who had given me the drafting tools, and he asked me every single question I had been hoping someone downstairs would ask. What the program involved, when it started, whether I was nervous, whether I was proud of myself. I remember thinking, even then, that it was strange how much easier it was to feel celebrated by a 78-year-old man on the phone than by the two people living under the same roof as me. By the time we were in college, at separate schools, the pattern was fully cemented. Vivienne went to a school 2 hours from home and came back every single year for her birthday, expecting and receiving a full family celebration. I went to a school 6 hours away, on a partial scholarship I had fought hard for, studying architecture, and most years I simply could not afford the trip home in the middle of the semester, and nobody ever suggested flying me home or driving to see me instead. My birthday, our birthday, became something that happened to Vivienne in the town where our family lived, with me as an optional footnote who occasionally got a phone call, usually late in the evening, usually after the party had already happened. I want to pause here and tell you honestly, I did not spend my 20s nursing open resentment about this. I want you to understand that, because it matters for what comes later. I built a story in my head that made the pattern bearable. I told myself Vivienne needed more affirmation than I did, that she was more emotionally fragile beneath the sparkle, that I was simply the stronger twin who did not require the same kind of external validation to feel secure. I told myself this so many times that I actually believed it, and in a strange way, believing it gave me a sense of quiet superiority that made the exclusion sting less. I was the mature one. I was the one who did not need a party to know she was loved. It was, I now recognize, a very sophisticated form of self-protection, and also a very effective way for everyone around me to avoid ever having an uncomfortable conversation. I met my husband, Desmond Ackhaffer, during my final year of architecture school, in a shared studio space where he was finishing his own graduate degree in structural engineering. Desmond grew up in a large, loud, deeply affectionate family in Atlanta, the kind of family where every single birthday, no matter whose it was, involved at minimum a home-cooked meal and a card and someone saying out loud, in front of everyone, "We are so glad you exist." The first time he witnessed my family's dynamic in person, at Thanksgiving during our second year of dating, he was quiet in the car on the way back to our apartment, and then he finally said, "Does anyone in your family know it's your birthday too, or does everyone genuinely think you were born on a different day than your sister?" I laughed it off. I told him it was fine, that it was just how our family operated, that I honestly did not mind. He did not push it that night, but I know now that he filed it away. And over the following years, he would occasionally, gently, ask me if I was really okay with it, and I would always say yes, because saying no felt like admitting that something inside me had been quietly starving for a very long time, and I was not ready to look directly at that hunger yet. We got married when I was 27, in a small ceremony that Desmond's family showed up for in overwhelming, joyful numbers. aunts and cousins flying in from 3 different states. And my side of the family showed up in a smaller, more reserved cluster that left immediately after the cake cutting because, as my mother explained, Vivienne had an event the following morning she needed to rest for. I remember standing in my wedding dress watching my in-laws dance with total abandon while my own mother checked her watch, and something in my chest tightened in a way I chose, once again, not to examine too closely. Over the following decade, I built something I am genuinely proud of. I started my own architecture and sustainable design firm, Ashworth Acknowledgment Studio, with Desmond eventually joining me full-time to run the structural side of the business. We started small, converting garages and doing residential additions, and by the time I was 34, we had a staff of 19 people and a client list that included 2 mid-sized hotel chains and a growing reputation for adaptive reuse projects, taking abandoned industrial buildings and turning them into beautiful mixed-use spaces. None of this came easily. I worked 80-hour weeks for years. I took out a second mortgage on our first house to make payroll during a lean stretch. I flew to conferences alone, pitched to skeptical investors alone, and slowly, painstakingly, built a name for myself in an industry that does not hand mid-sized firms owned by women very much room to fail. My family knew almost none of the details of this journey because they never asked. Every holiday gathering, the conversation orbited Vivienne's life, her job in event planning, her on-again, off-again relationship with a man named Trent that had been on-again, off-again for 9 years, her apartment renovation, her latest weekend trip. When I would mention a project, a new client, an award my firm had won, I would get a polite, "That's wonderful, honey," before the conversation swung back toward Vivienne within about 90 seconds. I stopped bringing things up eventually. Not out of bitterness, or that is what I told myself, but because it felt easier not to compete for airtime I was never going to win. This brings us to the year everything finally cracked open, the year I turned 35, the year of the balcony in Lisbon. 6 months before my birthday, my firm had been approached by a Portuguese hospitality group that wanted to convert a 19th-century textile factory in Lisbon into a boutique hotel and cultural center. A project worth more to my company than every project we had completed in the previous 3 years combined. It would put Ashworth Acknowledgment Studio on an international stage for the first time. I spent months preparing the pitch, flying back and forth twice for preliminary meetings, and the final presentation, the one that would determine whether we won the contract, happened to fall on October the 11th, my 35th birthday. I told my parents about the trip 6 weeks in advance, during a Sunday phone call that I remember with painful clarity now. I said, "Mom, I have to be in Lisbon for my birthday this year. It's the final pitch for that hotel project I told you about." There was a pause on the line, and then my mother said, "Oh, that's exciting, honey, good luck with that." And then within the same breath, "Did I tell you Vivienne is doing her party at the house this year instead of a restaurant? She wants string lights in the backyard. It's going to be so beautiful." I sat there holding the phone, waiting for some version of "we'll miss you," or "we'll celebrate when you're back," or even the smallest acknowledgement that October the 11th belonged to 2 people, not 1. It never came. I told myself, one more time, that it did not matter, that I had a hotel contract to win and a marriage to a man who loved me fiercely and a life that did not require my mother's calendar to feel complete. I flew to Lisbon with Desmond 4 days before the pitch. We worked brutal hours preparing the final materials, walking the factory site twice to double-check our structural proposals, rehearsing my presentation until I could deliver it in my sleep. On the morning of October the 11th, I woke up in that beautiful hotel room with the tall shuttered windows overlooking a cobblestone street. And Desmond had somehow, impossibly, arranged for a small bouquet of yellow roses to be waiting on the breakfast tray along with a card that said, "Happy birthday to the strongest woman I know. Today you're going to walk into that room and remind the whole city of Lisbon what you're made of." I cried a little, the good kind of crying, and then I put on my navy suit and I walked into that pitch meeting and I delivered the best presentation of my career. We won the contract. Ashworth Ackhafer Studio would be redesigning a piece of Lisbon's industrial history, and the client group took us to a celebratory dinner that night at a restaurant overlooking the Tagus River, where the lead partner stood up and toasted not only the project, but once he learned it was my birthday, toasted me personally, telling the whole table that he had rarely seen a presentation so precise and so passionate in the same breath. It was, by every objective measure, one of the best days of my professional life. And it was in the middle of that celebratory dinner, while a stranger in a foreign country was raising a glass to honor me, that my phone lit up on the white tablecloth with a text from my cousin Priya, who apparently did not realize what she was about to detonate. The text said, "Vivi's party looks incredible. Your mom outdid herself this year. Wish you could be there." Attached to a photo of the backyard, string lights, a rented arch covered in flowers, at least 40 people I recognized from a lifetime of family gatherings, all of them there, all of them present and accounted for on my birthday for a party that made no mention of me at all. That was the first photo. The one on the balcony later that night, the cake with 35 candles and my mother's caption about our girl, that came a few hours after, once I had excused myself from the dinner early, claiming exhaustion and Desmond, and I had walked back to the hotel mostly in silence, his hand tight around mine the entire way. Desmond fell asleep first that night, worn out from the week, but I lay awake for a long time, and then I got up quietly and went out to that balcony, and that is where you found me at the start of this story, standing in the warm Lisbon night with my phone face down on the little iron table, feeling something inside me finally, completely, stop pretending. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think it is important, and I think a lot of you have felt something similar at some point in your lives. It was not rage, not yet. It was something quieter and in some ways much heavier, a kind of grief for every version of myself across 18 years who had swallowed this same feeling and called it maturity. I thought about the 16-year-old girl in the kitchen offering up her own birthday to ease her mother's stress, never imagining that gift would be quietly cashed in, year after year, without her ever being asked again whether she wanted to keep giving it. I thought about every college birthday spent in a dorm room with a phone call that came after the party had already ended. I thought about my wedding day, watching my mother check her watch. And I thought about the fact that I was standing in one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, having just won the biggest contract of my career, and not a single person in my family of origin knew or cared that this day belonged to me too. Somewhere around midnight, I picked the phone back up, and instead of typing out an angry message, which is what 18 years of built-up hurt genuinely wanted me to do, I did something different. I opened my photos and I looked at the picture Desmond had taken of me that morning, standing in front of the textile factory in my navy suit with the yellow roses in my hand, and I looked at it for a long time and I made a decision. I was not going to say anything that night. I was not going to fire off a wounded text into a group chat at 1 in the morning Lisbon time. I was going to let this feeling settle, and when I got home, I was going to have a real conversation, the kind of conversation my family and I had never once had in 35 years, about what had actually been happening on the surface of a tradition none of us had ever properly examined. We stayed in Lisbon 2 more days after the pitch, partly for work and partly, I think, because some part of me was not ready to walk back into my old role the moment I landed. Desmond and I walked through the Alfama district and ate pastel de nata at a little bakery near the cathedral and talked, really talked, in a way we had circled around for years but never fully completed. He told me something that stuck with me the entire flight home. He said, "Delaney, I have watched you build an entire company from nothing. I have watched you negotiate with investors twice your age and win. I have watched you stand your ground with contractors trying to cut corners on safety. And I have never once seen you stand your ground with your own family. You deserve the same person in that backyard as you are in that boardroom." I did not have a response for him in that moment, but I carried those words with me onto the plane, through customs, through the long drive home from the airport, and into the driveway of our house, where a stack of mail and an unusually large number of missed calls from my mother were waiting for me. It turned out that Priya, my cousin, the same one who had unknowingly sent that first photo, had realized her mistake sometime the next morning, when she mentioned to my Aunt Rosalind in passing that she felt bad texting me party photos on my own birthday. Word apparently traveled through the family grapevine faster than I expected, because by the time I landed back in the States, there were 4 voicemails from my mother, each one increasingly anxious, the last one saying, "Delaney, honey, please call me back. I think we need to talk about something." I did not call her back that first night. I let myself have one full day to unpack, physically and emotionally, sitting on our back porch with Desmond, eating the leftover birthday cake he had insisted on buying from a bakery near our house the moment we landed. A small chocolate cake with my actual name written on it in blue icing. Just the 2 of us, no string lights, no 40 guests. And it was, strangely, one of the most peaceful birthdays I had had in years, even 4 days late. The following evening, I called my mother back. I sat at our kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me and Desmond sitting quietly across from me, not speaking but present, and I told my mother calmly that I needed her, my father, and Vivienne to all be on a call together, because there was something I needed to say, and I only wanted to say it once. My mother, to her credit, did not argue. Something in my voice must have told her this was not a conversation she could smooth over with her usual deflections. We got everyone on a video call 2 days later, a Sunday afternoon, my mother and father sitting together at their kitchen table looking nervous in a way I had rarely seen from either of them, and Vivienne joining from her apartment, her expression carefully composed in that way she gets when she senses she might be in trouble, but has not yet decided how she is going to handle it. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say, the way I rehearse a client pitch, because I knew if I went in unprepared, 18 years of suppressed hurt would come out as an unfocused explosion instead of a clear, honest reckoning. I started by telling them about Lisbon, about the pitch, about winning the contract, watching my mother's face soften with what looked like genuine surprise, because she had genuinely not registered the scale of what I had accomplished that week. And then I told them about the photos. About sitting at a celebratory dinner in a foreign country on my own birthday and watching, in real time, my entire family celebrate my twin sister without a single mention of me. I told them it was not really about that one night. I told them it was about 18 years of a pattern none of us had ever stopped to question. A pattern that started with a 16-year-old girl trying to ease her mother's financial stress for one single year, and somehow calcified into an unspoken family policy that Delaney does not need to be celebrated. My father, who rarely speaks first in family conversations, was the one who broke the silence, and he said something that surprised me. He said, "Delaney, I did not even realize, until you just said it, that we haven't done anything for your birthday specifically in years. I think I convinced myself somewhere along the way that you genuinely preferred it that way, and I never once asked if that was still true. I'm sorry. That's on me as much as anyone." My mother started crying almost immediately, saying she had no idea it had built up to this, that she loved me just as much as Vivienne, that she never meant for me to feel erased. And then there was Vivienne. Vivienne's face on that video call did something I will remember for the rest of my life. It did not soften the way our parents' faces had. It tightened, defensively, and she said, "Okay, I get that you're upset, but I don't think it's fair to make it sound like I've been intentionally excluding you for 18 years, Delaney. You literally told Mom when we were 16 that you didn't want a big deal made of your birthday. I just kept doing what you asked." This was the moment the twist finally broke the surface. The moment I learned that what I had experienced as passive neglect had, in at least some measure, been something far more deliberate. I told Vivienne, as calmly as I could manage, that a comment I made at 16 years old, during a specific financial crisis in our family, was not a lifelong permission slip to forget me every single year for the rest of both of our lives. and that if she had truly believed I did not want to be celebrated, the correct response, at any point in the following 18 years, would have been to check with me directly instead of simply continuing to benefit from the assumption. And that is when my mother, still crying, said something that changed the entire shape of the conversation. She said, "Vivienne, honey, I actually did try to check a few times over the years. I remember at least 2 birthdays where I asked you to call your sister and see what she wanted to do because I felt guilty focusing everything on you, and you told me she said she was busy and didn't want anything, that she'd rather we just focus on you since you'd already planned things." The room, or rather, the 4 little video boxes on my laptop screen, went very quiet. I had never received those calls. I had never told Vivienne I was busy or that I did not want anything. In 2 specific years my mother could recall, and possibly more that nobody remembered clearly enough to name, Vivienne had told our mother that she had spoken to me, that I had waved off the idea of a celebration, when in reality no such conversation had ever taken place. She had used the 16-year-old version of my generosity, and later, apparently, outright fabricated conversations that never happened, to keep the family's entire birthday attention locked onto herself, year after year. And she had done it so smoothly, so consistently, that even our own mother had absorbed it as settled fact. Vivienne's face on the screen went pale, and for a long moment she did not say anything at all. My father was the one who spoke next, his voice quiet but very firm, a tone I had heard from him maybe 3 times in my entire life. He said, "Vivienne, is that true? Did you tell your mother that Delaney said she didn't want anything when she never actually said that to you?" Vivienne started to cry then, but it was not, at least not at first, the kind of crying that comes from remorse. It was the kind of crying that comes from being caught, from watching a very old, very comfortable story about yourself begin to collapse in real time in front of the people whose good opinion you have spent your whole life curating. She said, "I don't know, okay? I don't know, I think somewhere along the way I liked having it be my day. And it was easier to tell Mom that Delaney didn't care than to actually ask her and risk her saying she did want something, because then I'd have had to share it, and I know how that sounds. I know it sounds awful, but I didn't wake up one day and decide to be a villain. It just kept happening, and it got easier every year to keep letting it happen." I sat there absorbing that confession, feeling a strange mixture of things at once. Vindication, because for 18 years some quiet part of me had wondered if I was simply overreacting, if the neglect I felt was really just my own insecurity dressed up as evidence, and now I finally had confirmation that something real had actually been done to me, not just imagined. But also, underneath the vindication, a deep and complicated sadness, because the sister sitting on that screen crying was still my twin, the person I had shared a womb with, a childhood bedroom with, countless inside jokes with, and hearing her admit, even in that stumbling, defensive way, that she had actively participated in erasing me rather than simply failing to notice me, cracked something open in my chest that I had not expected. I did not yell at her. I want you to know that, because I know some of you listening are hoping for the moment where I unload 18 years of fury onto my sister's face through a laptop screen, and I understand that impulse. But that is not who I am, and more importantly, it is not what this channel is about. I told Vivienne, as steadily as I could, that what hurt the most was not even the parties themselves. It was the loneliness of thinking, for 18 years, that my own family simply did not think of me, when the truth was more painful in a different way, that at least some of that erasure had been actively constructed by someone who was supposed to be the person who understood me best in the entire world, because we had literally started life in the exact same moment. I told my parents and my sister that I needed some space before we talked again, that I was not interested in a screaming match or an instant, tearful reconciliation, because both of those things tend to paper over real wounds instead of actually healing them. I told them I loved them, which was true, and that I needed time, which was also true, and I ended the call. The 3 weeks that followed were some of the strangest of my adult life. I threw myself into work, into the early design phases of the Lisbon hotel project, into the day-to-day operations of my firm, and I let Desmond hold a lot of the emotional weight I was carrying, which he did without complaint, the way he always has. My mother texted me almost daily, careful, gentle messages, not pushing, just checking in, telling me she loved me, occasionally sharing a memory from our childhood that had nothing to do with birthdays at all, just small offerings of connection. My father called once a week, which for him is significant since he is not a phone person, and our conversations were short but real. Him asking about the hotel project with a level of genuine curiosity he had never shown my work before, as though watching me finally say something true out loud had recalibrated something in how he saw me. Vivienne, for the first 2 weeks, went quiet. Not hostile, just quiet, and I understood that too, because being confronted with a version of yourself you do not want to be is its own kind of grief, and some people need to sit alone in that grief for a while before they can do anything productive with it. It was my mother who told me, during one of our calls, that Vivienne had started seeing a therapist, on her own, without anyone suggesting it to her. My mother said Vivienne had called her crying one night, saying she had spent her whole life terrified of not being special enough, that somewhere in being born 4 Minu. Tess after me, in an odd twist of birth order logic that never should have mattered but somehow did in our family's mythology, she had absorbed this belief that she had to fight harder to be noticed, that I was naturally the impressive twin, the one who would succeed no matter what, and that the only thing she had that felt entirely hers was being the center of a birthday celebration. And she had protected that one thing with a ferocity she was now deeply ashamed of. I want to be careful here, because I do not want this story to slide into the trap of excusing real harm just because there is a sympathetic explanation attached to it. What Vivienne did was wrong. Lying to our mother, repeatedly, about conversations that never happened, in order to keep an entire family's attention locked onto herself, while her own twin sister quietly absorbed 18 years of feeling forgotten. That is a real wrong, with real consequences, and understanding why someone does something does not erase the responsibility of having done it. But I also believe, and I believed it even in the rawest days of that first month, that people are usually more than the worst pattern they have ever repeated, and that the question that actually matters is not simply, "What did you do?" but "What are you willing to do now that you understand what you did?" 5 weeks after that first video call, Vivienne asked if she could come see me in person, alone, no parents, no mediating third party. I agreed. She drove the 2 hours to our house on a rainy Saturday afternoon, and she sat across from me at our kitchen table, the same table where I had first told my mother I needed everyone on a call, and she did something I did not expect. She had written things down. A full page, handwritten, not typed, which somehow made it feel more real. She read it out loud, her voice shaking through most of it, and she did not once try to soften what she had done or explain it away as accidental. She said, "I told myself for years that I was just going along with what you wanted, but I knew, somewhere underneath that story, that I was choosing not to check, because checking might have taken something away from me. I am not asking you to forgive me today. I know that's not something you owe me on any particular timeline. I just needed you to hear me say clearly that I know what I did, I know it was selfish, and I know 18 birthdays is not a small thing to have taken from you." I cried during that conversation, the first time I had properly cried since the balcony in Lisbon, and so did she. And it was not a clean, tidy movie moment of instant forgiveness. It was messier than that. I told her I needed her to understand that an apology, even a genuinely good one, was the beginning of trust being rebuilt, not the end of the process, and that I was not going to pretend everything was fine simply because she had said the right words in the right order. She told me she understood, and more importantly, over the months that followed, she actually showed me she understood in 100 small, consistent ways. The following February, 4 months after my birthday, Vivienne called me on a random Tuesday evening, no occasion, no reason, and asked if she could take me to lunch that weekend, just the two of us, no agenda beyond wanting to spend time together. This became a pattern. Not grand, dramatic gestures, but small, repeated proof. The kind of proof that actually rebuilds trust over time in a way that one big apology never can. She started remembering things about my work, asking real questions about the Lisbon project, asking to see photos of the finished factory renderings, showing up at a small gallery, opening my firm hosted to showcase the concept designs, standing in the corner in a nice dress, genuinely proud, telling anyone who would listen that her sister had designed something incredible. She also went to family counseling with our parents, all three of them together, something none of us had ever done before, because our family had operated for decades on the principle that if you simply avoided saying the uncomfortable thing out loud, the uncomfortable thing would eventually stop existing. In one of those sessions, which my mother later told me about with my permission, my mother admitted something that added another layer of understanding to the whole pattern. She admitted that she had always felt a specific, particular pressure from her own mother, our grandmother, who had passed away when Vivienne and I were in our 20s, to make sure Vivienne, the more visibly sensitive twin as a child, never felt overshadowed by her sister. My mother had absorbed a belief, unconsciously, across our whole childhood, that my emotional needs required less active management because I appeared, on the surface, more resilient, more self-sufficient, more able to handle disappointment without falling apart. She had mistaken my composure for contentment, for 35 years, without ever checking whether the composure was actually costing me something underneath. This is the part of the story I think matters most, the part that I hope stays with you after this video ends. My mother did not use that explanation as a shield either. She said it out loud, in that counseling session and later directly to me on the phone, not as an excuse, but as an honest accounting of how a family can build an entire structure of unfairness out of nothing but small, well-intentioned assumptions, none of which anyone ever stopped to question, layered on top of each other for 2 decades until the structure became load-bearing. My father made his own quieter form of amends. In April, 7 months after Lisbon, he called me and asked, almost shyly, if I would walk him through the blueprints of the textile factory conversion, because he wanted to actually understand what I did all day, something he realized he had never once properly asked about in 11 years of running my own company. We spent almost 2 hours on the phone, him asking increasingly detailed questions about load-bearing walls and adaptive reuse permits, and at the end he said, "I am so proud of you, Delaney, and I am ashamed it took me this long to actually ask you about your work instead of just saying that's nice, honey, on autopilot." I told him it was not too late, and I meant it. There was one moment that spring that I think crystallized for me just how much Vivienne was actually willing to change rather than simply perform change for an audience. My birthday is not the only date that had quietly belonged to her over the years. It turned out, once we started actually talking honestly, that a similar pattern had crept into other shared milestones too, smaller ones I had never even flagged as painful because they seemed too minor to raise on their own. Our grandmother's birthday, which our extended family still gathered to honor every March with a memorial lunch, had somehow become an occasion where Vivienne always gave the toast, every single year, because she had done it once, spontaneously, as a 22-year-old, and nobody had ever thought to rotate that role since. That March, 7 months after Lisbon, Vivienne pulled me aside before the lunch started and said, "I want you to give the toast this year. I've been doing it out of habit for 13 years, and I never once asked if you wanted a turn." And when I told her I actually did not want to give a toast, that public speaking to a room of aunts and uncles was not something I enjoyed the way she did. She said something that stuck with me. She said, "Okay, but I needed to actually offer, because the problem was never really about who gives the toast. It's about me remembering that you exist in these moments at all." I did not take the toast that year, but I noticed, for the first time in either of our adult lives, that she had thought to ask. Desmond's family played a quiet but important role during this stretch too. That same spring, his mother, Adiz, called me out of nowhere one Sunday afternoon, just to talk, the way she periodically does, and when I mentioned, almost in passing, what our family had been working through, she said something I have carried with me since. She told me that in her experience, raising 5 children of her own back in Atlanta, the children who learn early that their needs are inconvenient rarely announce that lesson loudly. They simply get quieter and more capable, and everyone around them mistakes that quiet capability for a sign that nothing is wrong, when it is often the loudest possible signal that something has been wrong for a very long time. She told me she was proud of me for finally making my family sit still long enough to hear it. I hung up that call and sat in my car in our driveway for a long time before I could bring myself to go inside, not because I was sad, but because for the first time, someone outside my own head had put into words exactly what those 18 years had actually cost me. By that summer, something had genuinely shifted in the texture of our family. Not perfectly, not without occasional awkwardness, because 18 years of pattern does not dissolve in 9 months just because everyone had one hard, honest conversation. There were still moments where old habits tried to reassert themselves. A family group chat where Vivienne's latest achievement got a flood of responses, while mine sat with fewer replies for a day before someone caught themselves and circled back. But the difference now was that people caught themselves. Vivienne, in particular, developed a habit of actively redirecting attention when she noticed it defaulting toward her, saying things in front of the whole family like, "Wait, before we talk about my thing, did everyone see the article about Delaney's firm in that architecture magazine? Someone send it to Aunt Rosalind. She'll want to see it." We also, as a family, did something we had never done in our entire lives. We set an actual, concrete plan for the following October, my 36th birthday, our 36th birthday, 7 months in advance, not as an afterthought, but as a deliberate act of repair. Vivienne proposed it herself during a phone call in May, and her proposal told me more about how much she had genuinely changed than any apology could have. She said, "I want to plan next year's birthday with you, not for you, with you. And I want it to actually be both of ours this time, equal from the very beginning, not something I control and you're invited to." We spent months on it together, actually, texting back and forth about themes and guest lists like we were teenagers again. Except this time, it was collaborative instead of me quietly deferring to whatever she wanted. We decided on something neither of us had ever had before, a joint celebration that honored both of our very different lives. Half the backyard decorated with soft string lights, and a dessert table full of Vivienne's favorite over-the-top confections, and half of it set up with a small display of architectural models and photographs from my recent projects, including a large printed rendering of the finished Lisbon hotel, which had, by that point, been completed and had already been written up in 2 industry publications. That October, on our actual birthday, 36 candles were split evenly across 2 cakes, 1 chocolate, my favorite, 1 red velvet, Vivienne's favorite, and my mother stood up in front of nearly 50 relatives and friends and gave a toast that she had clearly rehearsed, her voice shaking slightly, saying, "For a long time, this family got something wrong, and I am one of the people responsible for that, and I want to say, in front of everyone who loves us, that I am sorry. And I am so proud of both of my daughters in equal measure for exactly who they are." Vivienne stood next to her, holding my hand, and when it was her turn to speak, she looked directly at me and said, "Delaney has spent our whole lives being the sister everyone assumed did not need to be celebrated, and the truth is, she needed it just as much as I ever did. She was just better at hiding it, and I am done letting her hide it." I will admit, I was not composed during that part. Desmond, standing beside me with his hand steady on my back, later told me it was the first time in the 11 years he had known my family that he had watched all of us actually see each other clearly in the same room at the same time. We have kept that tradition going every year since. 2 cakes, equal attention, deliberate effort. Vivienne now sends me a calendar reminder every single September, a full month early, asking what I want to do for my half of the celebration, and every year I watch her actually mean the question. She started her own business a year later, a boutique event planning company, and I was one of her first clients. helping her design the visual branding for her studio. And there is something quietly full circle about that. The twin who once needed all the attention now building a career around thoughtfully creating moments of celebration for other people. Informed, I think, by finally understanding what it costs someone to be left out of one. My parents still go to occasional counseling sessions, individually now rather than as a family unit, working through the deeper patterns that shaped how they parented two very different daughters. My mother told me last spring that she has started, gently, examining the same dynamic in how she treats my brother Nathaniel's own kids, catching herself before old assumptions calcify into new blind spots, which felt to me like the truest measure of real change, not just repairing old harm, but actively working to prevent new versions of it. As for me, I no longer feel the need to perform composure as a substitute for actually being celebrated. I still do not need a party the way Vivienne once needed one. That part of my temperament has not changed, and I do not think it should have to. But I no longer confuse not needing something with not deserving it. And that distinction, small as it sounds, has changed the way I move through my entire life, not just my family. Ashworth Ackhofer Studio has since taken on 2 more international projects, and Desmond and I have started talking about opening a second office in Europe. And every single time I close a major deal now, I call my parents that same day, and every single time they pick up and they ask real questions, and they mean them. Do you think forgiveness always has to be earned slowly, in small, consistent actions, or can it sometimes be given first, as an act of faith that someone will grow into it? I would genuinely love to hear where you land on that, so let me know down in the comments.